The explosions lit up the darkness of space like deadly fireworks. Commander Jake Morrison watched from the command deck of the Terran defense platform Defiance as another human ship died in the void. The USS Guardian, a heavy cruiser that had fought in dozens of battles, broke apart under the relentless fire from the Vorthok fleet. Its crew of 800 souls vanished in a flash of light and twisted metal. Jake pressed his face against the reinforced window and counted the enemy ships again. 300 Vorthok warships surrounded Earth like hungry wolves around a wounded deer. Each ship was massive, built for war and destruction. Their dark hulls gleamed with weapons that could crack planets. The sight should have filled him with despair, but Jake Morrison had stopped feeling fear weeks ago. "Commander, we have 12 evacuation shuttles requesting permission to dock," said Lieutenant Amy Foster from her station. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the exhaustion in it. They had been fighting for 3 days straight with no rest. Amy was the best engineer he had ever worked with, a woman who could make broken machines work with spare parts and determination. "Grant them permission," Jake replied. "How many survivors are we talking about?" "About 200 civilians and 50 military personnel," Amy said as she worked at her console. "That brings our total to just over 300 people on the station." Jake nodded and turned back to the window. Earth hung below them like a blue and white marble, but even from this distance he could see the fires burning on the surface. The Vorthok had been bombing the planet for weeks, targeting cities and military bases. Billions of people were dead or dying. The lucky ones had escaped on the evacuation ships that were now fleeing toward the outer colonies. "Sir, we have an incoming transmission from the Vorthok fleet," reported Sergeant Rick Coleman from the communications station. Rick was a Marine who had served with Jake for 10 years. He was tough as nails and loyal to the core. If Rick was worried, he hid it well behind his professional mask. "Put it through," Jake said. He straightened his uniform and prepared to face the enemy. The main screen flickered to life, showing the face of a Vorthok commander. The alien was tall and reptilian, with scales that seemed to shift color in the light. Its eyes were cold and calculating, like those of a predator sizing up its prey. This was Kethvarn, the Vorthok fleet commander who had destroyed a dozen human worlds. "Human commander," Kethvarn said in perfect English, though his voice carried a hissing quality that made Jake's skin crawl. "I am Kethvarn of the Vorthok Empire. Your pathetic resistance ends now. Surrender your station and we will grant you a quick death." Jake looked at the alien for a long moment. Around him, his crew waited for his response. These were good people, men and women who had served Earth with honor. They deserved better than to die in this forgotten corner of space, but they also deserved to die as humans, not as slaves. "I have a counteroffer," Jake said calmly. "You can take your fleet and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Earth is under my protection." Kethvarn's eyes narrowed. "You command a single station against my fleet of 300 ships. You have no hope of victory." "Maybe not," Jake admitted. "But I have something you don't understand. I have nothing left to lose." He leaned forward, staring directly into the alien's eyes. "Come and take it." The transmission cut off. Jake turned to face his crew. 50 people looked back at him, waiting for orders. They were engineers, technicians, Marines, and support staff. None of them were heroes in the traditional sense, but they were about to become something more. "Listen up," Jake said. "I'm not going to lie to you. We're outgunned and outnumbered. The smart thing to do would be to evacuate with the civilians and live to fight another day." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I'm not leaving. Earth is my home, and I'll be damned if I let these monsters have it without a fight." Amy Foster stood up first. "I'm with you, Commander. My family died in the bombing of New York. I've got nowhere else to go." Rick Coleman nodded. "Marines don't run from a fight. We're staying." One by one, the other crew members voiced their agreement. Some were scared. Jake could see it in their eyes, but they were also determined. They would make their stand here on this station against impossible odds. "All right then," Jake said. Amy, I want you to reroute all non-essential power to weapons and shields. Rick, get your Marines ready for boarding actions. I want every corridor turned into a killing field. He looked around at his crew. We're going to show these aliens what humans are made of. The first attack came an hour later. Vorthak fighters swarmed around the station like angry insects, their weapons lighting up the darkness. The station's defensive guns opened fire, filling space with deadly energy beams. Jake watched from the command deck as his gunners picked off enemy fighters one by one. Shields holding at 60%, Amy reported. But they're throwing everything they have at us. Return fire, Jake ordered. Target their lead ships. The station's main guns swiveled and fired, sending massive energy bolts toward the Vorthak fleet. One bolt struck a Vorthak destroyer, punching through its shields and hull. The enemy ship exploded in a ball of fire and debris. Direct hit, shouted one of the gunners. Enemy destroyer destroyed. The crew cheered, but Jake knew it was just the beginning. The Vorthak had hundreds of ships, and they were just testing the station's defenses. The real battle was yet to come. As if reading his thoughts, Kethvarn's voice came over the communication system. Impressive, human. You destroyed one of my ships, but I have many more. Your resistance is pointless. Jake grabbed the microphone. Then why don't you come closer and say that? The Vorthak fleet began to move, closing in on the station like a tightening noose. Jake watched them come and felt a strange sense of calm. He had made his choice. He would stand and fight, no matter the odds. Behind him, his crew worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. They were ready. Earth would not fall without a fight. Jake Morrison would make sure of that. The battle had been raging for 6 hours when Jake Morrison realized they were fighting a different kind of war. The Vorthak ships came in waves, testing the station's defenses with calculated precision. Each attack was stronger than the last, and Jake could see the pattern. They were learning, adapting, finding weaknesses in his defense. Shields down to 30%, Amy Foster called out from her station. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked frantically to reroute power. I can give you weapons or shields, but not both at full power. Give me weapons, Jake said without hesitation. If we can't hurt them, the shields won't matter anyway. The station shuddered as another barrage of enemy fire struck the hull. Jake gripped the command chair and watched his tactical display. Red dots surrounded the blue icon representing his station. 300 enemy ships against one human outpost. The odds were impossible, but Jake had stopped caring about odds. Commander, we have a problem, Rick Coleman said from his position at the security station. The Vorthak are jamming our communications. I can't reach the evacuation fleet. Jake nodded grimly. The Vorthak were cutting off his station from the rest of humanity. They wanted to destroy him in isolation to prevent his final stand from inspiring others, but Jake had anticipated this. He walked to the main communications console and began adjusting the frequency. Amy, can you give me a boost to the quantum transmitter? He asked. I can try, she replied, her fingers dancing across her control panel. But it will drain power from life support? Do it, Jake ordered. He activated the transmitter and began broadcasting on all frequencies. His voice carried across the void, reaching every human ship in the galaxy. This is Commander Jake Morrison. Aboard the Terran defense platform Defiance. Earth is under attack, but we are not defeated. To all human ships, remember this moment. Remember that we stood here. Remember that we fought back. The transmission cut off as enemy fire disrupted the signal, but Jake knew his message had gotten through. Somewhere in the darkness of space, human survivors would hear his words and know that Earth had not fallen quietly. Incoming fighters, reported the sensor operator. 200 Vorthak attack craft closing fast. Jake turned to his weapons officer. All batteries, open fire. Don't let them get close. The station's defensive guns erupted in a symphony of destruction. Energy. Beams lanced out into space, finding their targets among the swarm of enemy fighters. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers as Vorthak ships died, but more kept coming. They were like a plague of metal insects, too many to stop. They're breaking through the outer perimeter, Amy shouted over the noise of battle. Hull breaches. On deck 7 and 12. Rick, get your Marines down there, Jake ordered. Seal those breaches and prepare for boarding actions. Rick Coleman gathered his 20 remaining Marines and headed for the damaged sections. Jake watched them go and felt a cold certainty in his gut. They were good soldiers, but they were facing an enemy that had conquered most of the galaxy. Still, they would fight. That was what humans did. The first boarding pod struck the station 15 minutes later. Jake felt the impact through the deck plating as Vorthic assault troops cut their way through the hull. Emergency alarms wailed throughout the station as the enemy poured into the corridors. Boarding parties on decks 5, 8, and 10, reported the tactical officer. They're moving toward the reactor core. Jake activated the internal communication system. All hands, this is the commander. The enemy is aboard the station. Fight them in every corridor, every room, every inch of space. Show them what humans are made of. The battle inside the station was brutal and desperate. Jake could hear the sounds of fighting echoing through the corridors, the crack of energy weapons, the shouts of his crew, and the alien sounds of the Vorthic warriors. On his tactical display, he watched as blue icons representing his people winked out one by one. Amy worked frantically at her station, trying to keep the lights on and the weapons firing. Her engineering crew was spread throughout the station, fighting running battles while trying to maintain critical systems. Every few minutes, she would lose contact with another team. I'm sealing off the compromised sections, she reported. It should slow them down, but it won't stop them. Jake nodded and moved to the weapons console. The station's main guns were still firing, still taking a toll on the enemy fleet. Every shot counted now. Every enemy ship he destroyed was one less threat to the human survivors fleeing through space. Commander, called the communications officer, I'm picking up transmissions from across the galaxy. Other species are talking about us. They're watching the battle. Jake felt a grim satisfaction. Good, let them watch. Let them see what happened when you backed a human into a corner. He keyed the transmitter again and spoke to the galaxy. This is Commander Morrison. We are still here. We are still fighting. The Vorthak thought they could crush us easily, but we are not so easily broken. To every species listening, remember this day. Remember that one human station held off an entire fleet. The transmission was cut short as explosions rocked the command deck. Vorthak soldiers had reached the upper levels. Jake could hear Rick Coleman and his Marines fighting desperately to keep them back, but the enemy was too numerous. Amy, can you overload the reactor core? Jake asked quietly. She looked at him with wide eyes. That would destroy the station, and everything around it, including a good chunk of their fleet, Jake replied. How long would it take? 10 minutes to set up the overload, she said. But once it starts, there's no stopping it, Jake made his decision. Do it, but not yet. We make them pay for every deck, every corridor, every room. We show them that humans don't go quietly. The battle raged on through the night. Jake's crew fought with a desperation born of knowledge that this was their last stand. They turned every corridor into a battlefield, every room into a fortress. The station's industrial fabricators worked overtime, creating improvised weapons and explosive devices. Rick Coleman's Marines held the engineering deck for 3 hours against overwhelming odds. When the Vorthak finally broke through, they found the corridors filled with deadly traps and a handful of humans who refused to die quietly. Rick himself made his final stand in the main engineering bay, taking down dozens of enemy soldiers. Before falling, Amy Foster died trying to repair a critical power coupling while under enemy fire. She kept working even as Vorthic energy beams cut through her protective gear. Her sacrifice kept the station's weapons online for another 2 hours. One by one, Jake's crew gave their lives. But with each death, they took enemy soldiers with them. The Vorthic were learning that conquering humans was not the same as conquering other species. Humans fought differently. They fought with a fury that came from knowing they were defending their home as dawn broke over the dying earth below. Jake Morrison stood alone on the command deck. His crew was gone, but the station's weapons were still firing. The enemy fleet had lost over 50 ships to his desperate defense. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Jake looked out at the stars and smiled grimly. He was the last human defending Earth, but he was not finished yet. The galaxy was watching, and he would give them something to remember. The news of Commander Jake Morrison's stand spread across the galaxy like wildfire. On distant worlds, beings of a dozen different species huddled around communication devices, listening to the impossible story of one human holding off an entire Vorthak fleet. The broadcasts were fragmented and broken, but the message was clear. Humanity was not going quietly into the darkness on the mining world of Kepler 442b. Lisa Parker wiped the sweat from her forehead and listened to the crackling. Radio transmission? She was 32 years old, tough as the rocks she blasted every day, and she had been working the mines since she was 18. The Vorthak had taken over her world 3 months ago, turning the human colonists into slaves. But Morrison's words changed something deep inside her. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to her fellow miners as they worked in the deep tunnels. "One human is fighting 300 ships and he's still alive." Tom Brady, an older miner with calloused hands and kind eyes, nodded grimly. "If he can do it alone, maybe we can do something too." Lisa looked around at her fellow workers. There were 200 humans in the mines, all of them strong from years of hard labor. Above them, only 50 Vorthak guards controlled the entire operation. The aliens had thought humans were weak and broken, but they had never seen miners fight. "Tonight," Lisa said quietly, "we take back our world." The word spread through the mines like a whisper in the darkness. The humans had been planning this for weeks, but Morrison's example gave them the courage to act. They had mining charges, heavy equipment, and most importantly, they had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, in the outer reaches of the Andromeda system, Captain Steve Mitchell received Morrison's transmission aboard the human cruiser Retribution. His ship was one of the last of Earth's fleet, carrying 300 survivors from the destroyed colony worlds. Steve had been planning to flee to the Outer Rim, to find some forgotten world where humans could hide and survive, but Morrison's words changed his mind. The commander was buying time with his life, and Steve realized he couldn't waste that sacrifice. He turned to his crew, men and women who had lost everything to the Vorthak war machine. "Change course," he ordered. "We're not running anymore." His first officer, a young woman named Karen White, looked at him with surprise. "Sir, we're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. The Vorthak control everything." "Maybe," Steve replied. "But Morrison is showing us something. He's showing us that one person can make a difference. If we hit their supply lines, cause trouble in their rear airs, maybe we can help him." The crew of the Retribution understood. They had been defeated, broken, scattered to the winds. But they were still human, and humans had a way of fighting back when cornered. Steve began plotting courses to Vorthak supply bases, planning hit-and-run attacks that would stretch the enemy thin back on Earth's orbital station. Jake Morrison fought alone against the darkness. His crew was gone, his weapons were failing, and the station was falling apart around him. But he was not finished. The quantum transmitter still worked, and he used it to broadcast tactical information to anyone who would listen. "This is Morrison," he said into the microphone, his voice hoarse from days of fighting. "I'm sharing everything I know about Vorthak tactics. Their ships are strong, but they have weaknesses. Hit them at the engine intakes. Their shields reset every 30 seconds. Use that gap." The transmission reached ears across the galaxy. On a dozen worlds, resistance fighters took notes. The Vorthak had seemed invincible, but Morrison was showing them how to fight back. His sacrifice was becoming something more than a last stand. It was becoming a lesson in warfare. The Lyrans were the first to act on Morrison's intelligence. These cat-like beings had been enslaved by the Vorthak for 50 years, but they were natural hunters with perfect night vision. They began assassination campaigns against Vorthak commanders, using Morrison's tactical data to plan their strikes. On the water world of Oceanus, the Aquarians listened to Morrison's broadcasts from their underwater cities. These dolphin-like beings were masters of underwater warfare. and they began attacking Vorthic ships that landed on their ocean surface. They used Morrison's shield timing data to coordinate their attacks, striking when the enemy was most vulnerable. The crystalline collective, silicon-based life forms that looked like living gems began sabotaging Vorthic technology from within. They could interface directly with electronic systems, and Morrison's technical broadcasts gave them the knowledge they needed to cause maximum damage, but it was Lisa Parker who struck the first major blow. On Kepler 442b, she and her fellow miners waited until the night shift change. The Vorthic guards were tired and careless, thinking their human slaves were broken and defeated. They were wrong. Lisa led 20 miners up from the deep tunnels, carrying mining charges and heavy equipment. They moved in silence, using their knowledge of the mine shafts to approach the guard posts from below. The Vorthic never saw them coming. 4. Morrison, Lisa whispered, and pressed the detonator. The explosions lit up the night sky as the main guard post vanished in a ball of fire. The human miners poured out of the tunnels like angry aunts, wielding mining lasers and industrial equipment as weapons. The Vorthic guards were trained soldiers, but they had never faced desperate humans armed with tools designed to cut through solid rock. The battle was short and brutal. The miners used their heavy machinery to crush enemy vehicles and their mining charges to destroy communications equipment. Within hours, they had driven the Vorthic from their world entirely. Lisa Parker, a simple miner, had liberated an entire planet. The news of the Kepler 442b uprising reached other worlds through smugglers and traders. The Zentari, a peaceful species that had been forced to serve the Vorthic as merchants, began secretly carrying messages and supplies to resistance groups. They admired Morrison's courage and wanted to help however they could. Emperor Vorthkane, the supreme ruler of the Vorthic Empire, received the reports with growing anger. His generals had assured him that the human resistance would collapse once Earth fell. Instead, one man's defiance was inspiring uprisings across the galaxy. How can one human cause so much trouble? He demanded from his throne room on the capital world of Vorthic Prime. His chief general, a scarred veteran named Kethmorn, had no answer. The humans fight differently than other species. They do not know when they are defeated. Then we will teach them, Vorthkane snarled. Send more fleets? Crush these uprisings before they spread further. But the uprisings were already spreading. On the industrial world of New Detroit, factory workers led by a man named Don Murphy began converting their production lines from consumer goods to weapons. They used Morrison's technical broadcasts to design new types of armor and weapons, turning their entire world into a fortress. The Corvin, warrior poets from the Spiral Arm, sent messages of respect and admiration to Morrison. These proud beings understood the concept of a glorious last stand, and they began organizing their own resistance movements. Captain Steve Mitchell and his crew struck their first blow against a Vorthic supply convoy. Using Morrison's tactical data, they disabled 3 enemy ships and escaped before reinforcements arrived. It was a small victory, but it proved that the human fleet was not finished. As the third week of the siege began, Jake Morrison stood alone on his battered command deck. His station was held together by emergency patches and determination, but he was still fighting. Every enemy ship he destroyed, every tactical tip he broadcast, every moment he continued to resist sent a message across the galaxy. The message was simple. One person could make a difference. One human, standing alone against impossible odds, had inspired an entire galaxy to fight back. The Vorthic Empire, which had seemed invincible just weeks before, was now facing rebellions on 100 worlds. Morrison smiled as he watched another enemy ship explode under his fire. He might be dying, but he was not dying alone. Across the galaxy, others were picking up the fight. His sacrifice was becoming something greater than he had ever imagined. 2 months had passed since Jake Morrison first stood alone against the Vorthic fleet. His orbital station was now a twisted wreck of metal and determination, held together by emergency force fields and pure human stubbornness. Jake himself was barely recognizable as the clean-cut commander who had started this fight. His left arm was gone, lost to shrapnel 3 weeks ago. His face was scarred from burns, and he walked with a limp from a piece of enemy metal that had nearly taken his leg, but he was still fighting. Every day, every hour, every minute that he continued to resist sent shockwaves through the Vorthak Empire. The aliens had sent their best ships, their finest commanders, their most deadly weapons against one human on a crippled space station. And that human was still there, still broadcasting, still shooting back. Jake's latest transmission reached across the galaxy as he sat in his ruined command center, surrounded by sparking consoles and makeshift repairs. His voice was tired but unbroken as he spoke into the microphone. "This is Commander Morrison, Day 63 of the siege. I want to tell you something about being human. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the smartest. Or the fastest. But we have something that others don't understand. We have the ability to choose our own fate. Every morning I wake up on this station, I make a choice to keep fighting. That choice is what makes us human." The words reached Lisa Parker on Kepler 442b, where she was now leading a planet-wide defense network. The Vorthak had sent 3 fleets to crush her mining world rebellion, but they found something they hadn't expected. The entire planet had been turned into a weapon. Every mine shaft was now a bunker, every piece of industrial equipment had been converted into a defensive tool. Lisa listened to Morrison's words as she stood in the command center built deep underground. Around her, former miners worked at control stations, coordinating the defense of their world. They had learned Morrison's lessons well, turning their knowledge of mining and heavy industry into military tactics. "He's been alone for 2 months, said Tom Brady, now her second in command. "How is he still alive?" "Because he's human," Lisa replied simply. "And humans don't quit." On the water world of Oceanus, the Aquarians had transformed their peaceful civilization into an underwater resistance network. They used Morrison's technical data to build new weapons that could strike at Vorthak ships from beneath the waves. Their leader, a wise old being named Current Singer, had memorized every one of Morrison's broadcasts. "The human teaches us about courage," Current Singer told his warriors as they prepared for another raid. "He shows us that size of body matters less than size of spirit." The Aquarian strike teams moved through the dark waters like living torpedoes, using Morrison's shield timing data to attack enemy ships at their weakest moments. They had sunk dozens of Vorthak vessels, proving that even peaceful species could learn to fight when properly motivated. Captain Steve Mitchell and his growing fleet of human survivors had become a constant thorn in the Vorthak side. What had started as one damaged cruiser had grown into a force of 20 ships, as scattered human survivors rallied to Morrison's example. They struck at supply lines, rescued prisoners, and generally made life miserable for the occupying forces. Steve stood on the bridge of the Retribution as his fleet prepared for their most daring raid yet. Intelligence from the Zentari traders indicated that a major Vorthak command ship was moving through the asteroid belt, carrying supplies for the siege of Earth. "Morrison has been fighting alone for 2 months, Steve told his crew. "The least we can do is make sure he knows he's not forgotten." The attack on the Vorthak command ship was swift and brutal. Steve's ships used Morrison's tactical data to coordinate their assault, hitting the enemy at precisely the right moments. The command ship was destroyed along with its escorts, and Steve made sure to broadcast the victory on the same frequency Morrison used, but it was the political changes that truly showed Morrison's impact. The Sovereign Assembly, a council of neutral species that had stayed out of galactic conflicts for centuries, was meeting in emergency session. The representative from the last free human colonies, Rachel Brooks, stood before the assembled delegates with tears in her eyes. "For 2 months, we have watched one human stand alone against an empire," she said. "Commander Morrison has shown us what courage looks like. He has reminded us that freedom is worth fighting for, no matter the odds." The Zentari delegate, a tall being with silver skin and large eyes, stood to speak. "The Zentari have remained neutral for many generations, but we can no longer watch good beings suffer while we do nothing. We vote to provide aid to the resistance. One by one, other species joined the vote. The Lyrans, the Aquarians, even the normally isolationist crystalline collective voted to help. The assembly that had never interfered in galactic politics was now officially supporting the rebellion that Morrison had inspired. The news of the assembly's decision reached Emperor Vorthkane on his throne world just as reports arrived of new uprisings on dozens of planets. His empire, which had seemed unshakable just months before, was cracking under the pressure of constant rebellion. "How many worlds are in revolt?" he demanded from his generals. 47 confirmed uprisings, Your Magnificence," replied General Kethmorn. "And the number grows daily. The humans have shown others how to fight back." "Then we end this source of inspiration," Vorthkane snarled. "Send everything we have to Earth. Destroy that station and kill this Morrison once and for all." But Morrison was no longer just a man on a station. He had become something more powerful than any weapon the Vorthak possessed. He had become an idea, a symbol that spread faster than their fleets could travel. Children across the galaxy whispered his name in defiance of their oppressors. Resistance fighters painted his words on walls in 100 different languages. The industrial world of New Detroit, Don Murphy's workers had turned their planet into a massive weapons factory. They worked around the clock, producing arms and equipment for resistance movements across the galaxy. Morrison's technical broadcasts had given them the knowledge they needed to create weapons that could hurt the Vorthak. "Every rifle we build, every ship we repair, every bullet we make is a vote for freedom," Don told his workers as they labored in the converted factories. "Morrison is showing us the way. We just have to be brave enough to follow." The Corvin warrior poets had composed epic songs about Morrison's stand. These proud beings, who valued honor above life itself, saw in the human commander a kindred spirit. They began their own uprisings, using their natural fighting skills and Morrison's tactical knowledge to strike at Vorthak forces. Even the Vorthak themselves were being affected by Morrison's example. Reports reached the Emperor of soldiers questioning orders, of officers showing mercy to prisoners, of entire units deserting rather than face the human ghost and his impossible fortress. The legend of Morrison was undermining the very foundations of the Empire. Back on the ruined station orbiting Earth, Jake Morrison prepared for what he knew would be his final battle. The Vorthak were massing every available ship for one last assault. He could see them on his damaged sensors, hundreds of vessels preparing to end his defiance once and for all. Jake activated his transmitter one more time, sending his voice across the galaxy to all who would listen. "This is Commander Morrison. They're coming for me now, everything they have left. But I want you to remember something. I may die today, but the idea of freedom will live on. You've shown me that one person can change the galaxy. Now it's your turn to carry the fight forward." He looked out at the approaching fleet and smiled. He had stood alone for 2 months, but he was no longer alone. Across the galaxy, millions of beings were standing with him in spirit. His sacrifice had awakened something that the Vorthak could never defeat. The final battle for Earth was about to begin, but Jake Morrison had already won the most important victory. He had reminded the galaxy what it meant to be free. The final battle began at dawn on the 74th day of the siege. Jake Morrison watched from his shattered command deck as every remaining Vorthak ship in the system moved toward his station. The enemy had grown tired of his defiance and decided to end it with overwhelming force. 500 ships now surrounded the orbital platform that had once been humanity's pride, and was now held together by emergency welds and one man's determination. Jake looked at his reflection in a broken screen and barely recognized himself. His beard was wild and gray, his remaining arm was wrapped in bandages, and his eyes held the weight of 2.5 months of constant battle. But those same eyes still burned with the fire that had kept him fighting when all hope seemed lost. "Computer, activate all remaining weapon systems," he said to the damaged artificial intelligence that somehow still functioned despite the destruction around it. "Warning, Commander Morrison," the computer replied in a voice distorted by damaged circuits. "Current power levels insufficient for sustained combat. Estimated operational time, 47 minutes. Then we make those 47 minutes count," Jake said with a grim smile. He moved to the communications console and opened a channel to the Vorthak fleet. The face of Kethvarn appeared on screen, but the alien commander looked different now. Where once there had been arrogant confidence, now there was frustration and something that might have been respect. "Human Morrison," Kethvarn said in his hissing voice. "You have fought well, but this ends today. Surrender now, and I will grant you a warrior's death." Jake laughed, a sound that echoed through the empty corridors of his dying station. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about me surviving. This was about showing the galaxy that freedom is worth fighting for, and I've already won that battle." "You have accomplished nothing," Kethvarn replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Empire will crush these rebellions as it has crushed all others." "Maybe," Jake admitted, "but you'll never crush the idea. Every being in this galaxy now knows that one person can make a difference. That's more powerful than all your ships." The transmission ended, and Jake prepared for the final assault. He activated every weapon system still functioning and began his last broadcast to the galaxy. His voice carried across the stars to millions of listeners who had followed his impossible stand. "This is Commander Jake Morrison, final transmission. From Earth Orbital Defense Platform. The enemy is coming with everything they have, and I probably won't survive the next hour. But I want you all to know something important. I may have stood alone, but I was never really alone. Every act of rebellion, every moment of defiance, every choice to stand up for what's right has been with me in this fight." The Vorthak fleet opened fire, and space around the station erupted in deadly light. Jake's weapons replied, sending streams of energy into the enemy formation. His gunners were all dead, so he fired manually, using targeting systems held together with spare parts and determination. "To Lisa Parker on Kepler 442, keep fighting," Jake continued as explosions rocked his station. "To Captain Steve Mitchell and the Free Fleet, never give up. To all the species that have joined this fight, remember that courage is contagious. Spread it everywhere you go." Far across the galaxy, his words reached eager ears. On New Detroit, Dan Murphy's workers stopped their production lines for a moment of silence, then doubled their efforts to build weapons for the resistance. On Oceanus, the Aquarians launched every submarine they had in a coordinated strike against Vorthak naval forces, but the most important listener was Captain Steve Mitchell, who sat in the command chair of the Retribution as his fleet approached. Earth at maximum speed. What had started as 20 ships had grown to over 100 as human survivors and allied species rallied to Morrison's example. They were still outnumbered, but they were no longer alone. "How long until we reach Earth?" Steve asked his navigator. 30 minutes at current speed," came the reply. "Too long," Steve muttered, then activated the fleet communications. "All ships, this is Captain Mitchell. Commander Morrison has been fighting alone for over 2 months. We will not let him die alone. Emergency jump to Earth system, all ships." The space around Earth suddenly filled with new arrivals as Steve's fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Human ships, Zentari traders carrying weapons, Lyran strike craft, and even a few Corvin honor guards appeared in a coordinated assault on the Vorthak fleet's rear. Jake felt the station shudder as enemy fire overwhelmed his remaining shields. Hull breaches opened to space, and emergency alarms wailed through corridors that no longer held atmosphere. But on his tactical display, he saw something that made him smile. New contacts were appearing, friendly ships arriving to join the fight. "Retribution to Defiance, do you copy?" Steve Mitchell's voice crackled through the damaged communications system. "I copy, Retribution," Jake replied, his voice filled with emotion. "Good to hear from you, Captain. We're here to get you out of there, Commander." "Negative," Jake said firmly. "I have one more card to play. Get your ships clear of the station." Jake moved to the reactor core controls, where Amy Foster had died trying to keep the lights on. His hands shook as he began the overload sequence that would turn his station into a massive bomb. The Vorthak fleet was clustered around him, thinking they had him trapped. They were about to learn their mistake. "All ships, this is Morrison," he broadcast on all frequencies. "Clear the area immediately. I'm giving these aliens a farewell gift they'll never forget. The reactor core began to overload its containment fields, deliberately failing under Jake's commands. He had minutes at most before the explosion would consume everything within 1,000 kilometers. The human and allied ships began pulling back, but many of the Vorthek vessels were too close to escape. Jake sat back in his command chair and activated his personal log for the last time. Personal log, Commander Jake Morrison, final entry. I came here to defend Earth, and I've done that. But more importantly, I've reminded the galaxy what it means to be free. The Vorthek thought they could break our spirits by destroying our worlds, but they forgot something important about humans. We don't break, we adapt, we overcome. We inspire others to do the same. The reactor core reached critical mass. Jake could see the Vorthek ships trying desperately to escape the growing energy field, but it was too late for most of them. Kethvarn's flagship was caught in the expanding destruction, along with over 200 other enemy vessels. This is for Amy, for Rick, for everyone who believed in freedom, Jake whispered as the energy wave consumed his station. The explosion lit up the Earth system like a new star. When the light faded, the Terran defense platform Defiance was gone, along with the man who had made it a symbol of hope. But Jake Morrison's sacrifice dealt a crippling blow to the Vorthek fleet. Nearly half their ships were destroyed in the blast. Captain Steve Mitchell led the Allied fleet against the survivors, using the tactical knowledge Morrison had shared to devastating effect. The Battle of Earth became a complete victory for the rebellion. The Vorthek forces that had seemed invincible just months before were scattered and broken. The news of Morrison's sacrifice and the victory at Earth spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. On world after world, the oppressed rose up with new hope. The Vorthek Empire, already weakened by months of rebellion, began to collapse. Emperor Vorthkane faced challenges from within his own alliance as member species questioned the cost of the war. Within a year, the Vorthek Empire was no more. The galaxy that had cowered under their rule was free, inspired by the example of one human who had refused to surrender. Children across the stars learned the story of Commander Jake Morrison, who had stood alone against impossible odds and changed the fate of the universe. A memorial was built where Morrison Station had made its final stand. Beings from across the galaxy came to pay their respects to the human who had reminded them all what courage looked like. His final words were carved in stone in 100 languages. As long as one human stands, we will fight. The galaxy had observed one human stand alone and win. Not through superior weapons or numbers, but through the simple power of refusing to give up. Jake Morrison had proven that sometimes one person's courage can light a fire that burns across the stars.